So let's talk about redemption. Let's shift to a trauma-informed system of care. And with that shift, the question's going to change from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. So there's an understanding that people come into services pretty banged up and bruised already. And so in a trauma-informed system of care, we're going to realize that trauma is not rare. Most of us have experienced some kind of event, whether it's natural or man-made disaster or personal and interpersonal. So a trauma-informed system of care realizes the prevalence of trauma. It recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma. And so instead of thinking in terms of symptoms, I'm thinking, or we're thinking in terms of adaptations, and coping responses. Realize, recognizes, and finally responds. Now the big question and worry that often happens is that everybody is going, wait a second, I wasn't trained to respond to trauma. I'm not a trauma therapist, and that's not what we mean. We're going to show you a little bit more about what this response means within your own training. So the person comes into the mental health system, and let's say they're so upset they can't even talk. So we're going to apply universal precautions, or universal expectation of trauma. We don't even need to know whether this person has experienced trauma, what that experience might have been. We basically expect it. And as a result, our assessment is going to necessarily take into account the I guess I call it the battered stress response system. We can no longer just look at a behavior and say that's maladaptive, or thinking or cognition in terms of maladaptive or chaotic or whatever. We need to understand that what we are seeing is a complex of the biopsychosocial, physiological, and that most often people's stress response system is just out of whack. There's all kinds of problems. When we shift the question, now, medication might be a part of this. There may be a diagnosis. But certainly the prognosis, the story of what to expect for the rest of your life is going to profoundly change. And what's really important here is that as a result of asking what happened to you, I want to make sure that the services and supports that I provide or we provide are going to meet the needs, the individual needs that brought you into services and caused or created so much profound distress. In a trauma-informed system of care, we also want to bring in peer supporters. When we are in a clinical environment, our relationships tend to be one way, and this sort of contributed to my sense of myself as only a mental patient, as someone that was only always receiving. And that happens as a result of this sort of helper and helpee relationship, where there is one way. One person is always in the giving role, one person is always in the receiving role. And remember, I said that, when I was out in the community, it was really hard for me, especially after I had really been institutionalized, to understand how to navigate relationship, how to just negotiate, how to take responsibility as part of, a person in connection to another human being. And when we're talking about peer supporters, we are talking about a two-way relationship. All right, and this two-way relationship we call a mutual reciprocal relationship, meaning a two-way relationship. There are times when I'm learning from you and times when you need my help. There are times when I can tell you about what it was like for me, and times when you can relate. There is a shared vulnerability in a two-way relationship when we have a person coming in with lived experience, able to connect with somebody in the darkest part of their own anger or shame or terror or hopelessness or despair. Focus isn't on what one of us needs. The focus isn't on what I need, and the focus isn't always on what you need. Our focus is now on what our relationship needs in order for us to stay connected. And I want to be clear, this is from intentional peer support and Sherry Mead's work in peer support. This is critical as we think about building capacity in the peer support community to address trauma. Additionally, in a trauma-informed organization or system of care, we've got services and supports that perhaps meet the need of the individual, right? But what about staff? And what about the impact of their life events? So in a trauma-informed system of care, we're going to look at governance, we're going to look at policies, there's a lot of different things, and we are going to assess every aspect of our organization. These are some of the components that we need to assess. We need to get down and dirty with the assessment. We need to look at if people come to where you are, let's look at the waiting room. Let's look at wait times. Let's look at what staff is doing when they greet somebody. But all of this will be assessed now in light of the very needs trauma survivors and all human beings really have in order to feel whole and good and like they can heal. And what they need is safety. And this is for staff too. Staff need to feel safe when they're working with me, but they also need to feel safe in terms of their work, where they're being sent, what they're being asked to do, how they're trained and prepared to work with folks. We all need trust. We need to be able to trust each other. We need to be able to trust that the organization is going to do what it says it's going to do. We need to be able to trust our colleagues, the folks that we're working with. We need a voice. We need choice. We need collaboration. And finally, we need empowerment. Now, these are what we call the trauma-informed principles. There's been more work in the U.S., and we also understand that culture is a major part of a trauma-informed organization, and like I said earlier, peer support. So in the U.S., we've added these two into what we already called our trauma-informed principles.